Dr. Madan, I want to make a loop back with something you said. It loops back to last year's conference about the future of globalization. You said India will play a role as the U.S. de-risks. Look, we should just be sure people understand what that is, especially during pandemic, but also because of rising U.S.-China trade tensions. These long supply chains into China are now called into question. And we heard last year, you remember, those of you who are here, stories about how so much of that is going into Mexico with the revamped NAFTA, and even China has got links into Mexico. But talk to me a little more deeply about India's role in this process, because it does still seem 11,000 kilometers away. The supply chains remain long, but there are some advantages to those making these decisions about where stuff comes from?
So I think there are three things that the US is trying to do, and India plays a role in one of them. As the US is thinking about, you want to call it decoupling, you can, de-risking, a different kind of globalization, not necessarily deglobalization. Some of it is, one basket is reshoring, bringing things back here, nearshoring, Mexico, and then there is kind of the friendshoring, which is on the economic and technological side, finding ways to work with its either supply chains or in terms of certain kinds of technology usages and practices and standards, very importantly, who's setting the standards of these things, working with like-minded partners. You can define, like-minded aren't same-minded partners for all the reasons that Dan said as well. But nonetheless, finding a group of people, not always allies, India isn't one, there are others, Vietnam is not one, but finding partners that help you diversify dependence, essentially. So the US is now doing what India has been doing since independence, which is diversifying its dependence. Now, part of the reason India fits into that basket, why is India willing to go along? One, it actually helps, India can make the case, come, make in India, as Prime Minister Modi has. The previous government had something called a national manufacturing plan. So it's basically come and help us grow that manufacturing that Dr. Subramanian was talking about, but also in terms of new technologies that India gets access to, advanced technologies. There's another aspect though. It is about kind of India attracting more global companies and saying, hey, we will help you de-risk. But it's also because India is also de-risking from China. India became, particularly in the trade realm, extremely dependent on China. China is India's second largest trading partner in goods. Most of that is Indian imports from China. So India too, both in trade and technology, investment less so, the most investment has plummeted from China because of Indian restrictions. But trade and technology, India too is de-risking. So it has an interest in being part of this process. But I think similarly, you will see for a while, just like you're seeing this in the US, it's not that we're necessarily importing less from China in the short term. It might be coming through different countries. It might even go up. So in India, in certain cases, trade is going up or imports are going up from China because for the short to medium term, even for things, for example, an American company producing the phones you have in your pocket is now saying, I'm going to diversify and tell my Taiwanese subcontractors go and manufacture in India, but where are the components right now coming from? They're coming from China. They're importing from China. Over time, you'll see that percentage decrease as the ecosystem is built out in India and Vietnam, et cetera. But at the end of the day, it's not that China is disappearing, hence not complete decoupling, but there is de-risking. Concern in both the US and India that economic ties with China are now not as much of an opportunity, but also posing vulnerabilities to both countries.
Thank you. I have a question to Dr. Markey, but I just want, are you getting, those of you in the remote locations or those of you watching at home, getting your questions ready for this session, but you can also start thinking about your questions for the grand session that will come after the break. You know the email address to do that if you're remotely. Dr. Markey, you spent some time, especially in the last fifth of your presentation, talking about concerns that US policymakers would have depending on the direction of India's internal politics and how India runs its country. We have an election in the United States, And you spent a lot of time talking about, rising nationalism in India, and different ways of looking at things that could be problematic. What are your thoughts about how the U.S.-India relationship might be affected if it is not Joe Biden in the White House come January?
David, I don't do domestic politics. Look, and I don't really, so I won't speculate too much, except to say that one of the interesting features of the US-India relationship, I mentioned over a long sweep now of different administrations, is that you've seen considerable enthusiasm for this relationship. Doesn't matter which party has been in power. You've seen significant investment of time and energy by presidents of both parties, and not always for exactly the same reasons. Certainly not, but enough similar reasons that there's actually some good logic to expect that, say, were a Trump to come in or anybody else, that they might actually pursue a similar approach. And to boil it down at this point, we are deeply concerned, all of us, about what the implications are of a rising China, and we're looking for friends in Asia. And India is one potential such friend. We are concerned about the direction of the global economy, and we can't afford to sit by and watch as 1/6 of humanity doesn't develop quite as quickly as it might. So that's also an interest of ours. So these interests will continue, but they will be framed differently, and there will be different aspects. Certainly, the Biden administration came in at least trumpeting a policy which had a lot more focus on things like human rights and democracy. It was very forthright about that. And we've seen where that's gone. It hasn't, I would say, quite lived up to that rhetoric. One could imagine a different administration have a lot less interest in that going forward.
Thank you. Your questions. We have some here. Let's bring a microphone right to the front, and then we'll go to number 2. Sorry to make you run. You got a mic, and then we've got plenty of time. This is going to be a good session here.
Thank you. Well, compliments to both of you. The presentations were superb, but I want to follow up on David's question. The bipartisan support for the India relationship was premised on a certain view of the United States and the world. Mm-hmm. If Trump gets elected, and I'm not concerned about Trump per se, but if the United States changes its view of how it relates to the world, both in terms of international relations and in terms of the international economy, what impact would that have on the future of the US-India relationship?
Do you want to jump on it first, and then I can?
I actually think that the prospect of a second Trump term is going to be, India will manage whoever comes next because of the reasons I said. The US is far too important for it to ignore. Plus, even if it's disruptive in the region, India will still have to deal with a second Trump term. I think there are broader concerns that nobody will talk about publicly officially, but there will be at the back of India's mind. And there will be planning for how to deal with it, including with other American allies and partners who are concerned about this. One of them will be, what does this mean for the US role in the world, but particularly, what does this mean for US commitments in Asia and the Indo-Pacific? India can't sit out a Taiwan Strait crisis. It's too close. It's not the Russia-Ukraine war. It's not far away. It will have to deal with it. So if you see instability in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea, and India sees the US not living up to its commitments, to essentially a President Trump who might say, why are we bothering with all these parts of the world? Actually, the Russians and Chinese are right. Spheres of influence world works. Russia, you deal with Europe. China, you deal with Asia. We'll sit here and do perfectly well on our own. That Asia for India is not an ideal India, an India that is a unipolar Asia, Ashley, as you know. So I think there are concerns. Now, the flip side is, the hope in India is that Trump 2 would be more like Trump 1, where essentially the people around him. But It's also not clear who will be, so it'll be important who the president is, but who are the people around him? What are their worldviews? What do they think about China competition? So if a Trump administration comes in and says, competition with China stays, it's important to have this role. In fact, we need to do more in the Indo-Pacific, less perhaps in Europe. That's a Trump that India would actually like. But the flip part is important. Second thing I would mention is on the economic side. The former President Trump has strong views on 3 subjects: alliances, and that's related to the first point about role in the world, trade, and immigration. Those other 2 things are going to be less friendly and less conducive to India. Not just going to impose tariffs on China. He's made very clear. Robert Lighthizer, former USDR, has just written a book, and he said, we'll impose more tariffs on India. Immigration. There are, depending on how you count it, but about 4 million people of Indian origin, 1.3 or so of those are Indians in the US. Towards the end of the Trump administration, Stephen Miller said, why do we have these H-1B high-skilled work visas? Before that, a few years ago, Steve Bannon said there are too many South Asians in Silicon Valley. Stephen Miller also talked about getting rid of this OPT, how you get a work component when you get a student visa. They got rid of spouses of H-1B workers on H-4s, didn't have the ability to work anymore. Sometimes they were even more qualified than their spouses. All this is going to affect India. 24% of India is the highest remittance getter in the world. 24% of those remittances comes from the US. So what happens here, sometimes India says, internal affairs, everybody should not bother. For the reasons Dan said, I do think we should care deeply about what happens in India, because our societies and economies are integrated. Same thing, I think Indians should care more about what happens here internally. So I'm less sanguine so yes, on the geopolitical side, things might be fine if China competition continues, but we don't know if that necessarily will be the case.
Dan?
Yeah, just a brief addition to that. Look, Ashley, if you think about it more in terms of a broader retreat from international involvement, a kind of a turn away from internationalism that has more or less characterized US foreign policy since the Second World War, then I think Tanvi was on the same track, which is basically that inward turn encourages other players to basically go it alone and not to see any value in partnerships and alliances and so on, but also to see the world as increasingly a Hobbesian, dog-eat-dog kind of place where none of the rules apply and everybody is out for themselves and must arm themselves accordingly. So the chances for arms races, for that type of behavior, I think only go up. So that's, to me, looks like a more dangerous, more violent world, and I'm afraid of that world. There's also a different component to this, and I don't want to go too far with this, but if American politics is increasingly, and our identity is increasingly defined, as I would say, in civilizational terms, that is in terms of culture, ethnicity, religion, as compared to ideological terms that have to do with more what we believe in, shared principles or values having to do with liberal protection of the individual. If that shift happens, then that further encourages that type of perception and worldview elsewhere. It grants legitimacy. It also undermines any support that we might have to such individuals who share a more liberal perspective elsewhere. And that would harm those people and would, again, just encourage the rise, which we're already seeing, of these civilizational perspectives and a characterization of the world in civilizational terms, which I think is also likely to be dangerous.
Thank you. There's a question up here on the balcony. Tell us your name.
Ahmed Ali from Edward Little in Auburn. How does China's Belt and Road Initiative impact India's economic objectives?
China has spent a lot of resources making friends around the world through its helping with infrastructure issues in places like, for instance, East Africa, but way beyond that.
It's a great question, and something I think India has actually thought a lot longer about than even the US did. So when China held its first Belt and Road Forum in 2017, the only major power that essentially boycotted it was India, and unusually actually released a statement saying, we do not believe, we think this is a national, not a global kind of project. It is supply-driven rather than demand-driven. It is going to affect countries' debt burdens, so it's not fiscally kind of responsible. But the reason India never joined Belt and Road was also mentioned in that, which is, and Dan's written a book on this, so I'll let him talk more about kind of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, but it's the China-Pakistan part of the Belt and Road, which goes through, there's some projects which are in territory disputed between India and Pakistan. And so India has always boycotted it because of what it says is Belt and Road violates territorial sovereignty, India's territorial integrity and sovereignty, India's, but also then said that this is not just about kind of India's concerns, that the impact of these Belt and Road projects were going to be felt in India's neighborhood. And the concern there is in Sri Lanka, now in Maldives, in Nepal, less so in Bangladesh, that this increasing Chinese economic involvement that precedes Belt and Road, but that it was going to be not necessarily just the economic ties and the debt burdens, but it was going to lead to these countries becoming more dependent on China. And therefore, China having more sway on their choices, including military ones, strategic ones, and more broadly, even kind of political choices at the end of the day. And so India has become concerned about some of these aspects. What is it doing? It is partly, it doesn't have the capacity to compete in terms of these projects, but it does have some connectivity projects in its region. It was used to having a monopoly in its region. It's now a more competitive marketplace. So India is trying to get better at delivery of its own projects, but also, as I mentioned, working with the US, for example, on the Sri Lankan port development, working with the US in Nepal in terms of the US financing some power production there that India is then buying, and also working with other countries, particularly Japan, also Australia, to actually offer alternatives. Because I think there's a recognition, you can't just tell countries, don't do business with China. The idea is to say, we can provide high quality alternatives, and working also with partners to try to ensure that the projects that countries do sign with China, that the terms are more transparent and accessible to these countries' publics. And the last thing I think India is doing is working now with, for example, in the Sri Lanka case, with France and Japan to help deal with debt restructuring and pushing, for example, at the G20 for this to be a major issue as well.
Dan, did you have anything? Or
I can be really quick. Tanvi did a great answer on that one. I would just say, the United States, in a way, actually followed India's lead when it came to explaining its concerns about China's Belt and Road Initiative. You're absolutely right. India came out ahead swinging, had some very parochial concerns about what China was doing in its neighborhood, but also had some broader and principled concerns about the way that China was structuring the Belt and Road Initiative and the kinds of arrangements that it was crafting for other countries and with other countries. And you mentioned kindly my book, so I'll use this as a means in. The key findings there really had to do with the extent to which other countries, so not India necessarily, but say Pakistan, or looked at Kazakhstan, or even Iran and Saudi Arabia, as they look at China's Belt and Road Initiative, they're independent actors, they're seeking alternatives, they want options. In a way, they want to use this, whatever China has on offer, to better their lot in the world, advance their agenda. And if they can do that by playing China against a third party, whether India and the Quad or India and Japan or whatever, they'll do so. And so it's very much a part of the geopolitical game. There is a purely economic component to it, but don't miss out on the very important politics of it. That's certainly how it's seen across the region and appreciated by leaders and interest groups within these other countries.
just a quick question. The person who asked the question, what year are you in school? Sophomore. Remind me to be nice to you because you're going to be my boss someday. Wow. We're going to go to a remote question in just a second, but there's a question down front, if we can bring a microphone actually to hear. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait, it's actually two famous people who want to ask questions. Pratap, thank you. Go for it. And then.
So thanks for great presentations. Nan, let me provoke you a little bit, kind of turn the gaze back on the US and in the spirit of collective thinking, right? So there's a view in India about the US, which would go something like this. The history of US presence in the international system in the last 30 years. So when we think of superpowers, superpowers are not now defined by their ability to get things done. They are defined by their ability to absorb failures, right? So Middle East, Iraq, Syria, the jury is out on Russia, Ukraine, at least the objectives of weakening Russia to the extent possible have not been achieved. So one, there is the fact, and it's not about raw capabilities. I mean, the United States is extraordinarily capable. But there is this overestimation of US power that has been consistently on display over the last 30 years, right? The second fact is that the US is the single biggest exception to the international liberal rules-based system, right? It signs the fewest treaties. It claims the greatest exemptions from itself, whether it's ICJ, ICC, all of that. Number three, human rights has almost never, unless it's some small country, played a sincere and significant aspect in US foreign policy. The Chinese can do repression in Xinjiang. Everybody was happy trading with them, including, by the way, the Organization of Islamic States, right? And, you know, the US's long histories. And so on this cynical view, so long as India grows at 8%, and there is money for US business to be made, all of these other concerns that you outline are actually not going to be significant. They're good for us think tankers, but nothing in the history of US foreign policy suggests that they're going to be dominant concerns. And that the Indian regime understands this and is actually playing the US eye to eye and calling its bluff.
All right. You want a quick response?
Yeah. Of course, you won't be surprised. I've heard similar things before. And it's a great question. It's an important question. And there's multiple questions embedded in the question, so I don't know that I'll be able to approach them both. But one question I guess, response would be, as I look to the nature of the US-India relationship, I agree that interests will and should drive a vast part of it. That's just the way it works. Those are material interests, business interests, military interests, and so on. But where the values part comes in ought to be, and I think actually has the realistic potential to be, a constraint on the ceiling of the relationship. This is a material difference between the type of cooperation the United States has between Saudi Arabia, where we candidly share very few interests, maybe none. Ideals, principles, but many interests. We do a lot with them. We don't do everything with them. We do a great deal more with our allies, with whom we've identified shared principles as well as interests. So it's in that ceiling space where I think the business is actually to be conducted by people who care about these things, and also by people who think that, the value of the relationship lies in trust, and without that additional element of values, you don't have the trust. And so you can do all kinds of deals, but you're going to hold back at the high end. So that's one quick answer. And then if I could, there is this repeated characterization of US behavior as deeply hypocritical, and it's true, right? Our values are not honored consistently. And the liberal order is something that the United States has been guilty of violating repeatedly. And yet, Americans still get upset when you accuse them of that. Why? Because it is hypocrisy. It is not living up to our ambitions. It's when we don't get upset about that hypocrisy that you really have a problem. And I'm afraid about that as being part of our future. I don't think we're there yet, but when we get accused of hypocrisy, that means that somebody expects something more from us. I think that's a good thing.
Dr. Madan?
even if you didn't care about anything of what Dan said, you don't care about values in other countries from a purely strategic realpolitik dimension. If all of you who spoke before us on the domestic political side and domestic economic developments, all of you pointed out that this could affect India's capabilities, its ability to be that economic growth engine, and potentially even its military capability. If you're devoting time doing internal security duties, you're not doing it abroad, you're seeing this in India's northeast. It does take away. There are kind of trade-offs. And so forget anything to do with values. From a strategic and economic interest point of view, at some point, if India is not an effective actor and these issues that all of you talked about start affecting its capabilities and capacities, then the US will care. Even realpolitik, US will care.
We are up against the clock. Professor Varshney, I promise, solemn promise, that you get your shot in this next panel for what was on your mind. 11 o'clock.